Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We're pleased to welcome Leslie Chang as part of the Authors at Google program. Leslie Chang is a former Beijing correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and has lived in China for over a decade. In her book, Factory Girls, she explores the migration of 130 million Chinese workers, mostly women, from the village to the factory. She tells a story through the lens of several young women who she tracks over the course of several years as they attempt to rise above the assembly lines and stake their claim in the talent market. Within the narrative of these women, Leslie Chang also weaves in the story of her own family and history. The book has been described as a book of global significance that provides new insight into China. Factory Girls demonstrates how the mass movement from rural villages to cities is remaking individual lives and transforming Chinese society. So without further ado, we're pleased to welcome Leslie Chang.
Hi. Thanks all for coming today. I was privileged to eat in your cafeteria and have a little tour of your herb garden. And walking around, I realized this is actually similar to a Chinese shoe factory. They feed you, they take care of you, and in return, you just have to work every minute of your waking life. So it's a nice parallel. I thought I'd start reading from the diary of a young migrant worker named Wu Chunming. What is there to be proud of? True, we don't have much. We don't have mobile phones in our hands. We don't have pagers on our belts. Our pockets are always empty. We are the plainest of plain migrant workers. But we still have capital we can be proud of. We are still young. It doesn't matter that our pockets are empty, as long as our brains are not. Because we are still young, we can work hard and struggle. After 10 or 20 years, who dares to be certain that we will not have mobile phones in our hands and pagers at our belts? My friends, do not feel inferior because we are ordinary migrant workers. We have no reason to feel inferior. There is no rule that success belongs to anyone. The door of success is always open. Go find out whether those mobile phone-holding bosses started out as bosses. Maybe those bosses were once ordinary migrant workers too. So Chunming came to Dongguan, a South China factory city, in 1993 when she was 18 years old. She was one among the millions of migrants who moved from a Chinese farming village to the cities of the coast to find work. Her first job was at the Guotong toy factory, where she was paid 100 yuan a month, about $12. And almost as soon as she came to the city, she started keeping a diary. And as I got to know her, she shared with me this fascinating document that was full of inspirational sayings from a variety of sources, including, "Every day is the best day of the year," Ralph Waldo Emerson. "There are no shortcuts," Beverly Sills. "The most important trait for a manager is decisiveness," Lee Iacocca. Sometimes she even quoted herself, "We can be ordinary, but we must not be vulgar," Wu Chunming. In the pages of the diary, she constantly berated herself to work harder, to sleep less, to lose weight, and to learn Cantonese, the dialect of her bosses in her factory. She wrote, "You have already had more than 2 months but made no progress in Cantonese. Do you remember your goal when you entered this factory was to learn Cantonese? If you cannot learn it this year, then you are a dumb pig, a dumb ox, and you need not do migrant work in Guangdong anymore. You would be better off at home." After a few months, Chunming quit her job, jumped to another factory, quit that one as well, was almost tricked into working in a massage parlor, escaped, and wandered homeless and penniless on the streets of Dongguan for a month. Finally, she found work at the Yinhui toy factory, mixing plastic that was used to make toy cars, planes, and trains. Her diary contains a vivid description of life on the assembly line. "We start work at 7 in the morning and get off work at 9 at night. Afterwards, we shower and wash our clothes. At around 10, those with money go out for midnight snacks. Those without money go to sleep. We sleep until 6:30 in the morning. No one wants to get out of bed, but we must work at 7. 20 minutes to go. Crawl out of bed, rub your swollen eyes, wash your face. 10 minutes to go. Those who want breakfast use these 10 minutes to eat, but I've seen many people not eat. I don't know if it's because they don't want to eat or to save money, or to stay thin. I certainly would not ignore my health for the sake of thinness or saving money. After all, what is the point of doing migrant work? Can it be that it is just to earn this little bit of money? Almost as soon as she got to the factory, Chunming started plotting how to move up from the assembly line. She had grown up poor on a farm. Her parents were both farmers. Her mother was illiterate, and she herself had only gone to middle school. And yet her drive for learning and self-improvement was astonishing. Her greatest fear, as she wrote again and again in her diary, was of getting stuck where she was, an ordinary worker in a Chinese factory. Next month, after we are paid, I will register at the Shorthand Secretarial Correspondence University. I must get a college diploma. I certainly did not come to Guangdong just to earn this 200 or 300 yuan a month. This is merely a temporary stopping place. This is definitely not the place I will stay forever. No one will understand me, and I don't need others to understand me. I can only walk my road and let other people talk. Her first 3 years in the city, Chunming did not go home even once. In her diary, she confided the reason. Who knows why I'm not going home for the new year? The main reason, I really do not want to waste time, because I must study. She was moving away from the world of her parents, whose hopes for her were only stability and marriage to someone from a nearby village, hopefully as early as possible. In a letter home, she wrote, "Father and Mother, it looks like we really cannot communicate between us. You will never know and never understand what is really in your daughter's heart. Maybe you think that I've already found my ideal factory. Maybe you think that I will never again jump factories. Maybe your wish is that I never jump factories again, that I work at this factory for 2 years and then come home to get married, to have a family like all the girls in the countryside. But I'm not thinking any of these things. My plan is, 1, to study at Correspondence University. 2, to learn to speak Cantonese. 3, with nothing to my name and with no accomplishment, to absolutely not marry." After 6 months on the assembly line, Chunming heard that her factory was hiring for clerks, and she wrote a long letter to her boss explaining why she was qualified, and she got the job. Her new pay was 300 yuan a month, triple what she had earned just the year earlier. As Chunming moved up in the factory world, the nature of her diary changed. She no longer recorded the mundane details of her workday. She no longer wrote down every month exactly how much money she was paid and how much she saved. Her parents appeared less and less, and eventually they disappeared altogether. Instead, Chunming was busy copying down rules in her diary, the rules of behavior for a successful professional person. These included Benjamin Franklin's 12 rules of morality, the 9 rules of receiving criticism, the 8 cardinal rules of selling, the 5 rules for applying eyeshadow, and the 10 eating taboos, which included do not force yourself to drink alcohol and do not spit out food scraps on the floor. The most important rule was one she had learned early and would never forget, as she wrote, "Since I have come to Guangdong, I have jumped factories 4 or 5 times, and each factory was better than the last. More important was that at each instance, I relied on myself. I never begged for help from anyone. Although I have a few good friends, not one helped me at the time when I most needed it. I remember when I fled back from Shenzhen. At that time, I truly had nothing to my name. Other than my own self, I had nothing else. I wandered outside for a month, completely penniless, once even going hungry for 2 days, and no one knew. Although older cousin and his wife were in Longyan, I did not want to go find them because they could not really help me. I often wanted to rely on others, but they cannot be relied on. You can only rely on yourself. Yes, I can only rely on myself." So China today has about 130 million migrant workers in factories, restaurants, construction sites, elevators, delivery services, house cleaning, child raising, garbage collecting, barbershops, and brothels. Almost every worker is a migrant from rural China. Together, these young men and women power the export economy, making the shoes, toys, handbags, computers, and mobile phones that we use every day. They represent the largest migration in human history, 3 times the number of people who came from Europe to America over a century. This life is hard, as you can see from Chunming's diary. This is a life that's ruled by the factory clock, with long hours, low pay, and tedious, repetitive work. But it is also a life of opportunity, as you see from her diary, an opportunity to learn to make money, to learn new skills, and to move beyond the expectations of traditional China. When I asked migrants what they liked about the city, it was striking how many of them said the same thing. I like the freedom, they told me. Migrants described the move to the city as 改变命运, changing your fate. Along the way, they are also changing China's fate. They're overturning ancient ideas, such as that the younger generation must always defer to the elders, that sons are more valuable than daughters, that home and family must always be central to existence. These migrants put themselves first, showing an individualism that's new in China. One young woman I wrote about told me in her village there had been a popular old saying, to live an entire life without making a long journey is good fortune. But in recent years, so many young people had left the village that now the villagers said something different to each other. The farther away from home you go, the more splendid it is. So I met Chunming in 2004 when I started reporting about migrants. At that time, I was working as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and many of the papers, including my own, had already done stories about life in the factories. But they tended to focus on the worst cases, the abuses, the miseries, the injuries, the terrible bosses, all of whom exist in spades. But I thought it might be interesting to write about what migration felt like from the migrants' point of view, what it was like to go out from a village at the age of 16, to make new friends, to find a job, to date, to relate to your parents after you'd left home. So I looked for and found a couple of young women who I could write about over a long period of time. And over 3 years, I watched as Chunming dealt with an awful boss, quit to start her own company, and changed professions 5 times, from selling paint to industrial mold parts, to nutritional supplements, glue, life insurance, and Snoopy brand diapers. She was constantly trying on new versions of herself, getting braces or coloring her hair, trying some new fad diet. I felt like I was watching her create an individual identity, and it was changing all the time. We originally met at the Making Friends Club, which was the largest dating agency in Dongguan. I was hoping to meet some older migrant women, which in a city full of teenage factory workers meant someone over the age of 30. Over time, I watched Chunming's tireless search for a suitable husband. Usually after a migrant landed a stable job, finding a suitable husband or wife was the main focus of their life. But in the village, couples would usually be introduced by relatives or matchmakers. In the city, they had to navigate an unfamiliar world, approaching strangers, making small talk, sometimes even meeting men online. So I'll read a little bit from my book about Chunming's dating experiences. Chunming had 2 dates from the Making Friends Club. The first time, a man came in a taxi from another part of Dongguan. She went downstairs to meet him on the sidewalk outside her apartment building. They took a good look at each other. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. "I think you're pretty," he said. "Let's just be friends then," she said. The taxi had not left yet, so the man got back in and cruised off. The second date took place at a soy milk restaurant near Chunming's apartment. The man got lost and was half an hour late, so she started eating by herself. It was 9 in the morning. When her date finally showed up, he was upset that Chunming had started without him. He tried to take charge and order soup for her, but she refused it. "He ordered hot soup and cold milk," Chunming told me later. "Can you imagine? A hot liquid and a cold liquid. That was his breakfast." After this liquid nourishment, the man suggested they go for a walk together. It was 9 in the morning and he wants to go for a walk. Chunming told the man she had some things to take care of, but he didn't take the hint. "Let's just be friends then," Chunming said. Finally, he understood. After that, Chunming gave up on the Making Friends Club. She put more faith in meeting people through the internet, which she believed drew a higher class of men. One of the things I found interesting about the migrants was how they could coexist in a very traditional world and a very modern world together. So one interesting thing was watching Chunming meet men online, and she let me sit next to her and watch her as she met these strange men. So I'm going to read a little bit from that. One day when I was over at her apartment, Chunming showed me how the QQ chat service worked. When you went online, you could pull down a list of everyone who was online at that moment, selecting for traits like native province, city of residence, age, and gender. She warned me that people talked about sex a lot. These are things we can't say in the real world, she explained, so we say them online. She had been online only a few minutes when a man approached. He was a friend of a friend and had been introduced to her as a potential boyfriend. Are you working? Yes. Are you? No, I'm at home. Where are you? The man was an urban planner in Dongguan, originally from Shandong province. He was 27 years old, 3 years younger than Chunming, though she lied and told him she was 25. The conversation quickly progressed to turning on their computer video cameras so they could see each other. The young man looked serious and heavy-set, with glasses. Sorry, I am ugly, he wrote. Are you frightened? Chunming turned to me. He looks like an honest person. Not at all, she wrote. I think you look okay. Are you married? Do you have a boyfriend? No. Ah, so you are more conservative then. No, I'm not conservative, but I'm more traditional. In what way? She leaned back in her chair looking at me, thinking aloud. In what way? The young man was impatient. Sex? The conversation frequently jumped ahead of her. The young man typed much faster than Chunming did. Educated people knew how to type, but Chunming had little formal schooling. No, not in sex, she wrote. To be honest, I go online to meet a boyfriend. Why must marriage be the goal? It doesn't have to be. To meet friends is good too. How much can you accept? He was asking whether she would have sex with a man who was just a friend, Chunming interpreted for me. When can we meet? I am free after work. Oh no, she squealed. He wants to meet me. Chunming met up with the young man that night. He seemed like a good person and he had a good job, she told me afterward. But he was very ugly, she said, with a pot belly and a zit at the base of his nostril. Over the next few months, she seesawed between these two conflicting points of view. He is very ugly. He went to a brand name school. He is mature for his age. He is very ugly. She accompanied him on a shopping trip to buy a sofa for his apartment. She slept with him once, but she could not bring herself to start a real relationship with him. Most Chinese marriages are not built on love, she told me. Perhaps I will have such a marriage, but I am not ready to compromise just yet. So as Chunming became more materially successful, her search for meaning in life took her in some odd directions. For a while, she was obsessed with studying English. And then the next time I saw her, she had dropped that and had joined a pyramid scheme selling nutritional supplements. After that, she gave up on the nutritional supplements, but started eating only raw fruits and vegetables, and she urged me that I must do the same. I'm still in touch with Chunming. She's doing well. She's still not married. She recently sent me a posting that she put on a popular social networking website. I wanted to end on that because it seemed like a really nice expression of her life philosophy. When well-meaning friends learn that I'm not married, some will say jokingly, "Don't have such high demands. If everyone were like you, our society would be in trouble." But in my heart, I think, why must I lower my standards just because of my age? But I'm more mature now. I know how to dress up and be feminine, and I know more and more about the ways of the world. So I should raise my standards for finding a boyfriend. Maybe a lot of friends think my high demands are for an apartment, a car, and so on. In terms of material wealth, I believe that in this society, with so many opportunities, as long as a person has dreams and drive and is willing to work hard, then what should come will come. I have always believed that God looks out for those who are diligent, brave, and enterprising. I will work hard to seek my happiness. I believe I will surely have my own happiness because being a good woman will bring happiness, and I am a good woman. Thank you. So does anyone have any questions?
If you have any questions, can you please step up to the mic over there? Thank you.
Hi. The first thing I want to say is I'm a really big fan of the book Rivertown. So.
Oh. I'll tell my husband.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I was in China in 1980.
Actually, maybe I won't tell my husband.
I was in China in 1985, and I traveled around a lot. And when I met people on the train, they typically, the Chinese people, they would ask me about China, but I was just like a waitress traveling around, and I got the impression that people weren't allowed to travel very much. Mm-hmm. So what's it like now? Do the migrants, people can pick up and go anywhere, or?
Basically, yeah. The reality is there are still a lot of restrictions. Theoretically, you can't live, you're supposed to live in the place where you're registered to live. It's a household registration system. But the reality is, as with so many things in China, that the law and the reality are two very different things. So now it's very common for people to leave home and go to the city to work, and the paperwork, and they'll figure it out somehow. If they end up moving, living long-term in the city, getting married, having children, then they have to do the paperwork and pay some fees in order to live there legally. But when you were traveling there was when migration was first starting in China. So sort of the most pioneering entrepreneurial people would have left home, but it wasn't at all the phenomenon it is now. It's just kind of massive and very common.
When you picked out your subjects, did you pick them for the fact that they stood out and somehow, or did you pick them because they were representative of a typical migrant?
Mm-hmm. Kind of both. It was important to me to, I thought I'd write about a couple women and follow them for a number of years. So I wanted their basic profile to be quite representative, meaning came from rural China, not especially educated, probably usually middle school education, maybe a little bit of high school or vocational high school, and then come out to work sort of in their late teens, 16 or 17. So in that sense, both these young women that I focus on were quite representative. But they also stood out because their personalities were quite strong, and they were quite vocal and active and lively and interested in talking with me. And those were all really important things, because I learned pretty soon after I got there that the big challenge is not getting to know someone, but it's staying in touch with that person, because people are so mobile. And if you meet them and you don't talk to them within a month, they're gone. All the numbers they gave you are not working anymore. And if you met one of their friends and asked them, often the friend wouldn't know where they'd gone. So a big part of it was that they would need to be somehow interested in me and my world, in the world that I represented, in order for them to also want to stay in touch with me over time.
So how do people like Chunming first come from a rural area and goes to a city area? I mean, what incentivized them to come? Like, do they hear about the city and come by themselves, or are there recruiters who go down there and try to get them to come? What's the process generally for these factory workers?
Yeah, that's actually changed. In the early days, it was sort of the most pioneering, adventurous people who went out, in the 80s and early 90s. And it was seen as kind of scandalous, especially for a young woman who wasn't married, to go out to the city. And people said, because Chunming went out pretty early. She went out in 1993. And she said in her village, they'd said, young girls who go to the city will be tricked into brothels and never heard from again. And, her parents didn't tell other people where she'd gone or what she was working at. But, the past decade, migration has become so entrenched and so common that it's now kind of a rite of passage for young people. And they expect that once they, as you know, the education system in China is sort of like a pyramid. So if you, go through middle school, but you don't test into high school, then that's the time you go out to work. Or in some cases, you might test into high school, but your family doesn't have the money to pay all the fees. So most young people in the village expect that they'll be going out to the city at some point to work. So it's no longer seen as scandalous or terrible. It's just kind of normal. And one of the young women I write about, who I call Min in the book, she had 3 younger siblings, and they were very much looking forward to going to the city for work. They felt like it was very exciting and new. And her little brother was really excited because Min had told him all about how great McDonald's is, and he was really excited to go eat at McDonald's, which she described to me as, oh, they make food that's especially suitable for Chinese people. That's how she described McDonald's to me. Anyone else?
I have another question. So there's pull factors like money and McDonald's that bring these people to the cities. What are the push factors? What's pushing them out of the villages?
Generally, it's just that there isn't much work in the countryside. You know, you're talking about poorer families for sure, but these aren't families generally who are starving and can't, you know, don't know how they're going to get through the next month. It's just that there's almost no work to be had in the countryside. So that's the push factor. Just you can either go to the city or have a life of idleness and boredom in the village. And, you know, there are some people who don't leave the village and they just kind of hang around, do some very small-scale business or trade or delivery or something. You know, but generally anyone who has any sort of enterprising talent or interest or curiosity will go to the city. Yes.
So my question is, in the book, it was clear that women in their early teens and 20s were the most desirable factory workers. And so I was wondering what happens to older women who try to look for factory work, or do they work for a little bit and then go back to their villages?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are several answers to it. Someone like Chunming, who I actually met when she was 31, she had started out on the assembly line and worked her way up. And so that was one way. Basically, you work your way out of the assembly line by the time you hit the maximum working age, preferred working age, which is about 25. You know, some women just worked on the assembly line for years and years, married someone, and went back to the village to farm. But that's becoming less and less common in my observations. I think in many cases now, young women will work on the assembly line, get married, and then, you know, to a fellow migrant and continue to live in the city, rent a small apartment. And then maybe once they're married, they might set up a small shop or do some different kind of work. You know, assembly line work is generally seen as for young single people. They live in the dorms. Everything's very, you know, taken care of for them. And once they get older, they might move into a slightly different kind of migrant work.
So this may be a simplistic question, but is there a general impression of the kind of privileges workers like we experience have, or people in the factory environment that you're describing? Or and then kind of a second part is, if someone's working so hard making toys, do they have some sort of judgment about how frivolous the things are that they're working so hard to produce?
I'm sorry, what was your first question?
What's the impression of, so people are working very hard there, and do they have an impression of the kind of work ethic that we have, or the kind of privileges that we
in American,
American or Western or industrialized?
You know, among the people I was spending time with, they have very little understanding what America is, so they wouldn't be thinking, oh, Americans work really hard or Americans are really lazy. You know, they just don't really have much sense of it at all. For them, America is kind of a, you know, it's the apotheosis of everything modern. It's like the latest cell phone or the best factory. It's more of a symbolic thing than a real thing. But you know, among educated Chinese, I think they have many opinions about that, and more sophisticated worldly Chinese might know that, you know, Americans probably used to work very hard, but now they don't work so hard anymore, and their lives are too good, or, you know, they'll see things on TV. But among the migrants, I knew not much understanding or impression of America. And as to the products that they were making, that's interesting, because one thing I noticed was that the workers had almost no interest or engagement in the products they were making at all. You know, it was sort of like this classic Marx thing where you're completely alienated from the product of your labor. And usually when I met someone, that was never something they would tell me was what their factory actually made. They would tell me the salary, how many people lived in a dorm, you know, how good the conditions were, what the boss was like. And then it would take forever before I could ask them, you know, well, what do you make? And they would they would say, oh, something that goes into the piece that goes into the keyboard of the computer. You know, like it just wasn't at all what they cared about. For them, it was just kind of, this is the opportunity to work, and if I don't like it, I'll go somewhere else. But so it wasn't at all, you know, oh, I'm making this ridiculous toy for spoiled American children, or, you know, this expensive shoe, and they didn't really have a conception of that.
What are the guys doing?
Hanging out, drinking and smoking. Yeah, some of the, you know, the gender divides in the factory towns are really interesting because, you know, the assembly line workers are generally women, but then there are certain jobs in the factory that the bosses feel like only men can do, and that's often more technical jobs, you know, the mold, the machines and things like that, and generally the top jobs in the factory are held by men. But, you know, I focused on Dongguan because I was interested in the young women in the factories. But other places, you know, in Beijing or Shanghai, you'll see much more, you know, male workers than female. Many of them are working on construction sites. That's probably the biggest employer for migrant men in the country. You know, various things, delivery, small-scale trade, different things. You know, I chose to focus on women because I thought that their move from the countryside to the city probably was from the most traditional part to the most modern part, because in traditional China, women are still in a more traditional role. So I thought it would be interesting to see the changes in their lives and the conflicts that they had to deal with. Yes?
I'm not familiar with your work in the Wall Street Journal, but I was wondering if this was kind of an extension of the correspondence you had done, or whether this was something you did kind of on the side.
Mm-hmm. It started as a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal, and the more I reported, the more I realized that there was probably a book in there, and I better write it before someone else did. So I took a book leave from the journal to work on this book, and then actually once I started writing the book, I realized that I could never go back to the newspaper again. So I eventually just left the paper to finish this book.
I was wondering if you have met any migrating workers that regretted moving to the cities, and if so, what were their reasons?
Yeah, you know, I think for all the migrants, it was a very complicated thing. You know, you never heard a migrant say, I'm thrilled I came to the city and I'm really happy with my life. Like that's a sentiment you probably would never hear a Chinese person say. And I think the reason is because as they come to the city, it's sort of step by step. You know, first you're making 100 yuan a month, and then you make 200. You're like, oh my God, I'm making 200 yuan a month. And then you get dissatisfied. I want to make 400 yuan a month. So I think at every stage, they're kind of just looking ahead to the next step. And so there was never a sense that people were looking back and appreciating everything that they had gone through. So there was never really a sense that people felt really, really satisfied with their lives. And you know, the flip side of that is it was never like, you know, certainly there are some people who are lonely and miss home and feel dissatisfied, but I felt like in every migrant I met, there was sort of this combination. You know, they were really thrilled to be in the city, but they were dissatisfied with their situation, and it was kind of like a mix of both things, depending on which day you talk to them. And even the migrants who, you know, they had a really bad situation, a terrible fight with their boss, got fired. What they would generally do was go home, spend some time at home, get bored, and then come back out again in a month. You know, I never heard a case of, you know, someone who just felt defeated and then just went home and never came out again. You know, I guess there are cases like that. I shouldn't say never, but the general trend was to go home, take a rest, come back out, go home, come out, rather than just to go home in defeat and become a farmer. That was not really an option for them. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering if they ever spoke about the dreams that they have for their children, what kind of futures they envision for their children.
What kind of dreams they have for their children?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the migrants I knew generally, you know, their expectations change really quickly. And, you know, one thing that's interesting is migrants often, you know, after they got married and had a kid, they would send the kid back to the village to be raised by their parents while the kid was a baby. But then most of them had very strong feelings that, you know, when my child is ready for elementary school or middle school. I want them back in the city because the city, there's better education, and my parents have really outdated ideas about child rearing. So, very quickly they absorbed these modern ideas, for better or worse, about how their children should be raised. That was one of the things that I think changed really quickly for them.
Hi, I'm curious what you observed in terms of their feelings or concerns about the government. Were they
About the government? Mm-hmm.
Right. Were they ambivalent? Were they positive or negative?
Almost completely apathetic. That was another striking thing about getting to know these migrants and this migrant world, was how little the government mattered or was even present in this place. Obviously very different from a place like Beijing or Shanghai, which is quite well managed and overseen. This is one of the many, many large teeming cities in China where you just feel like things are just bursting out and everyone's just kind of doing what they want, and there really isn't much presence of government. And I was, in terms of my reporting, I usually wouldn't sit down with a long list of questions and ask them what they thought. I would kind of see what they chose to tell me, and the government issue almost never came up in terms of the political system or the leaders. In fact, one time I was sitting with a younger migrant woman I write about, and some older men at the table were talking about Mao, and she said, "Who is Chairman Mao now? I don't even know who it is." And then she said, what happened? I think I said Hu Jintao, who's the president, and she said, "Oh, I thought it was Jiang Zemin, but then I heard that he had died." And I said, "No, he's not dead." And she said, "Oh, these things mean very little to me." And that seemed to kind of encapsulate how most of them feel about the government far away.
So a long time ago, when I was studying Chinese history, we kind of talked about the importance of Confucianism in throughout society and culture. And then that shifted to Maoism and communism. But with the fall of that, what has really replaced it? Is it now kind of when you're talking, it seems like it's just driven by materialism and pursuit of wealth. Is there a yearning for is that why Falun Gong could be popular, or Christianity? Mm-hmm. Like, are the migrant workers trying to search for higher meaning in life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think when they first come out, it's, as you say, materialistic, purely pragmatic. As in Chunming's diary, how many yuan I'm making every month and how much I'm saving. But I think once they get a little more stable, and I saw this very clearly in her case, some of them do search for more meaning. Some of them just want more money and nicer houses and cars. But she seemed to be engaged in this incredible search for something beyond money. But it was somehow always tied to money. It was like, I'm going to sell life insurance and bring stability to people and make money. So it was kind of a search for something that would allow her to make a living, but also have a deeper meaning. And definitely among kind of middle class urban Chinese, this search is very strong. I mean, you mentioned Falun Gong. There's a huge resurgence in religious belief in China, not just Falun Gong, but Christianity. And, I knew lots of Baha'i believers in Beijing. So people are searching pretty strongly for something. And it's kind of what you say. It's originally they had the Confucian ideas, then they had the Mao ideas, now they have the money ideas. People are just buffeted back and forth between all these conflicting ideologies, and they're trying to get some grounding or something that makes them feel a little more secure.
I was wondering what you thought might happen kind of on a macro level with all these people moving on as a first question, and then also as a second, do you foresee that there might be more government interference or they would start to create unions and kind of formalize things a little bit more?
Yeah, in terms of the macro level, I mean, I think you do see this huge urbanization of China, which in my opinion is how things always should have been, because during the communist year, I guess we're still in the communist years, but in the more radical communist years, the idea was keep most people on the farm, and then the privileged people live in the cities, have the jobs and the benefits. So basically, there are a lot more people living in rural China than actually can be supported by the agricultural system. So all these people moving to the city, it feeds the factories and the economy, but to me it also rights this weird imbalance in terms of the population. In terms of the unions, I think it's moving very slowly. As you may know, right now in China there's only one permitted union, the All China Federation of Workers, and that's actually a official union. It's not at all independent unions dedicated to helping workers fight their employers. I think that will develop. I think many things happen in China if people want them. It's not a democratic system, but if people, for example, in the cities won't settle for a lot of environmental degradation, and so they're becoming more active in fighting certain projects, and the government will listen. So I think right now among the workers, their main goal is just to make their own lives a little better, focus on their individual situation, and the instinct is not to band together and fight injustice. I think it's partly because that's not legal, but it's also partly their own focus. And I think if you have a lot of these movements where people are fighting injustice, then the government will have to respond.
Are there other writers or blogs on China that you follow or would recommend that you think are pretty spot on?
Yeah, there are a couple blogs that I read. One is danwei.com, DANWEI. They do a lot of translations of the Chinese press, kind of issues of the day. I find that very useful. There's another one called China Beat, that's sort of China professors and writers, and that's kind of interesting too. Generally I think the writing about China is hopefully changing. I think in the earlier days you had a lot of China journalists who would write there, I've been in China 4 years and this is my book of everything I put in my notebook. That's it. But I think now, partly as the country's opening up and it's really possible to travel and to spend, weeks and weeks with people and really, really hang out with them. So hopefully there will be more books that look at really deep aspects of life there. So yeah, there are a bunch of China books out this year that I think are take that approach.
First of all, thanks for writing on this fascinating topic. I can't wait to read the book. I'm also a huge fan of The River Town. I also read your husband's second book as well. Could you share a bit about what you two are working on next? And also, is there a lot of collaboration among you two, or even competition maybe? Do you share research results?
I'm not going to answer that. No. Yeah, he actually, I'll put in a plug for him. He's just finished his third book on China. It's going to be called Country Driving, and it's probably coming out in about 9 months to a year, focusing on 3 different stories, but how the automobile is affecting people's lives in different ways. In terms of collaboration, definitely. I mean, we report on our own and write on our own. Those are solitary endeavors, but definitely he's helped me a lot in terms of figuring out how to shape the book and the approach, and we talk endlessly about the people we like and the people we don't like, and the kinds of writing that we think coming out of China is good and the kind that we think is bad. Yeah, I guess we have pretty strong opinions about that. And we live in a very small town in southwestern Colorado where there's no other Chinese people or people who care anything about China, so we spend a lot of time talking to each other about this.
I wanted to ask you, how much do you think the lives of the migrant workers are influenced by the cuoco system, and why do you think the government keeps it around even though they don't do anything to enforce people working in their provinces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the cuoco system, the household registration system, I think it still exists, but in a place like Dongguan, it just has less and less relevance to most workers. And I think the government's policy on that has changed as well. I think in the old days, there were regular police sweeps, especially ahead of National Day or big events, where they would round up all the people on the street, asked to see their IDs. If they didn't have the right ID card, they would hold them in a detention center or even bus them back to their province. And for various reasons, I think that's changed in recent years. And in most places, the government's attitude towards migrants is kind of neglect, which from their point of view is a good thing. We don't want the worst thing in China is when the government focuses on you, even if they want to help you. You'd rather they just leave you alone and you can do your own thing. And in recent years, I think that's kind of how it's evolved. And I think the policymakers also acknowledge that migration is a huge positive benefit for the economy, that without this, you wouldn't have people doing all these jobs that they're doing. So this kind of reflexive prejudice against the rural, uneducated poor that urban and educated people have in China, I think is, I don't think it's going away, but people are gradually acknowledging that there's a positive side to that too.
Okay, so many thanks to Leslie for coming here today. If you want to get your book signed or if you have any remaining questions for her, she'll be here afterwards for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. So thank you.